Okay. Okay, well, Dr. Trounstine, thank you for doing this interview with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I just wanted to say that I have read your book and I found it engrossing. I highlighted many sections of it, and I also, with my pencil, I took notes in the margins. And it feels like the kind of book that you want to read passages of and mark them to go back later to read them again, to really absorb what you're saying.
Thank you.
So I wanted to first ask you, so you start off mentioning that there was a puzzle that motivated this research project, a puzzle having to do with the quality of benefits people receive from the government. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. When I started thinking about this book, I was actually living in New Jersey, and I lived right on the border of two towns. And I couldn't help but notice that driving from one town to the next changed the road plowing in the winter. So when I was in one town, the roads would be clear and I could get to where I needed to go. And then as soon as I crossed over to the other town, the roads would be full of ice, snow piled up, dirty snow left over from previous storms. And I started to think about why would that be? Why would one town be able to clear their roads and the next door town not be able to clear their roads? And the more I thought about this, the more it became obvious that there's lots of ways in which the place that you live really determines the quality of the government benefits that you receive, right? So, and mostly people think about this with regard to schools, right? We think about this when we're picking where we're going to live, because we think about sort of what are the schools around here. And even before I had kids, I thought about the schools because I thought about how it was going to affect my neighborhood and my community and the people that I was going to get to know. And of course, my property values, right? So the place that you live determines what kinds of benefits that you get to access from the government. And when I started to think about why this would be the case, it turned out to be a little bit more of a puzzle than it first seemed. So why would this be? Why do some cities have money to clear the roads and other cities don't? Why are some schools attracting the top teachers and other schools are not? And it turns out that after a decade of research, that the answer to this puzzle is segregation. And that the place that you live determines what you have access to is overlaid heavily in the United States with race and class. And this, again, seems obvious when you say it, that there are cities where the community is predominantly people of color, and they have many fewer benefits from government than communities where the population is predominantly white and wealthy. And everyone can think about a city that they know of, or a part of town that they know of, where all the wealthy people live and the houses are beautiful and the roads are so nice and it looks so clean and pristine. And you can think about places that don't have those benefits.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
How is it that with all the protests that have happened, the marches on City Hall, on the state capitol, on the US Capitol, all the laws that are passed, all the picketing and all those things, how is it that we have segregation so entrenched in US society?
It's a terrific question. So I'm gonna answer your question by giving some history, which is a little bit of an annoying thing to do, but I'll eventually answer your question. So when I first started to investigate this, sort of how we got to be segregated, why we're segregated, and why do some cities have money and other cities don't, I thought, I'll do a history and I'll go way back to the 1960s, because that's before I was born. So that's history. And I got to the 1960s, and it was perfectly clear in all the research that I was doing that everything that was happening in the 1960s was determined by stuff that had happened in the 1950s, which was determined by what had happened in the 1940s. And I kept going back and back. And I finally threw up my hands and I said, I got to start at the earliest place I can start, which turns out to be the 1890 census. So I started my research before cities were really cities in the way that we think about them. Most of the American population in the 1800s, 1890s, and early 1900s was rural, right? Most people lived on farms. And so what I tried to understand was, when did we get to be segregated? How did that process happen? And then how does it persist? And so now I'm going to finally answer your question. The answer is that segregation is deeply embedded in the United States geography. And it's been embedded in United States geography from the 1890s, really, literally. As soon as people of color, mostly former slaves and free Blacks, moved into cities in both the South and the North, as well as massive flows of migrants and immigrants from Europe and later on Eastern Europe and Russia, coming to big cities in the United States to work in the emerging factories of the Industrial Revolution, and then sort of becoming part of the fabric of cities. It's at that moment that cities begin using their powers of land use regulation to segregate people. Now, I want to sort of make a caveat here, which is that some segregation happens by choice, right? Sometimes communities come to a particular location and they want to live near other people who speak their language or who have similar interests or similar careers, right? And so not all of the segregation that I saw in the early 1900s was something that was driven by what cities did, but a lot of it was. And the important point, and this is how it gets to today, is that when city governments and the state governments and federal government enact policies that affect segregation, that entrench segregation, they're sticky. And that stickiness becomes very hard to undo. And so even if people might like to be more integrated, might like to live among people who are different from them along racial or class lines, once the government gets involved in putting segregation in place, it's really hard to undo it. And that's where we are today, right? So we just completed the 2020 census, and I'm guessing that the trends from the 2010 census will continue, which is that we continue to be a very segregated nation. And in some ways, more segregated today than we were in the 1950s. It depends on the dimensions that you're talking about.
That's amazing. And I've heard it said, my husband's grandmother would say to him as a child, that if they, referring to white individuals, if they just got to know us better, they'd see that we are just like they are and we have the same wants and needs and desires as they are. If they would just live among us, they would see that. But it sounds like living among us, all of us living among each other is really not in our hands, but in the hands of the power structure.
That's right. And this is what we this is what I refer to as segregation by design. This is the way in which segregation gets embedded into our communities. And it does take a lot of the individual choice out of the matter, right? And particularly along economic lines. If you have a budget that permits you to live in a house that has a particular size mortgage, or a rental house or a rental apartment that has a particular amount of rent that is due, and no rental properties and no houses to buy exist in a particular neighborhood, you're not going to live in that neighborhood, right? And so all of these factors combine to make it so that segregation is much easier to continue than it is to undo.
So I understand that local politicians use many different strategies to maintain this separation. Can you talk about some of these strategies?
Yeah, sure. So there are lots of different sort of things that governments do and have done to entrench segregation. And people are generally familiar, at least they've heard like the term redlining before. That's a government action that has occurred, but that's at the federal level. And so my book and my work has focused at the local level. And local politicians and local bureaucrats can enact similar kinds of rules and regulations that behave in the same way that redlining does, right? And so some of those things sort of very clearly are the kind of housing that is allowed to be developed in particular parts of the city, right? So if you prohibit apartment complexes or multifamily dwellings from being built in a particular part of the city or from being built in the city at all, then you limit the population of people who can access housing in that community to people who can afford it, right? Because apartments and multifamily dwellings cost less than single family homes. And we can expand that larger and larger, right? So there are many, many communities in the United States that have at least one part of town where every acre, every parcel has to be at least a half an acre or an acre. That's a much more expensive house than a house that can be built on an eighth of an acre, right? And so when cities pass these land use regulations that determine what housing can be built, where it can be built, how it is going to look, and very importantly, who gets to have a say in the land use regulatory process, all of these different features of the local government environment overview of land use regulation can affect segregation. They don't always have to affect segregation, but they have the opportunity to. And my work suggests that the more regulations a city has, literally just having more things that govern land use regulation tends to increase the amount of segregation that the city is going to have. There are other strategies that cities have used too, right? And so you can think about the placement of highways, right? If you have to build a new highway, you have to disrupt some community. You have to make some people move. Well, it turns out that historically, the people who are made to move, who lose their homes, who lose their community, tend to be the politically least powerful members of our society. And historically, that has been people of color, renters, and people on the lower end of the income distribution. And so those communities tend to be the ones that are disrupted when cities make choices like building a highway or clearing space to put in a new mall, right? There are lots of different ways that communities get disrupted.
So what if the local political base was disrupted? What if more people of diverse backgrounds ran for office, more people of color, people of various economic means, ethnic backgrounds, et cetera, ran and won city council seats? Now, would this take care of things, or at least begin to chip away at this?
Yeah. So what my work shows is that when you elect more people of color, when you have more diverse voices in the planning process, it tends to slow the entrenchment of segregation. This is not something that's in the book, but in other work that I've done that follows on to the book, I have found that one of the most successful mechanisms to force cities to change their land use regulation and their regulatory framework are lawsuits, unfortunately. Because I say unfortunately because they're very expensive for both sides, and they're targeted and particularistic, right? But it is true that that electing more people of color, that having the planning process not be dominated by white property owners or real estate interests can change the way that people think about neighborhoods and community and participation.
Okay, so you were saying lawsuits can be helpful with this. Lawsuits can make a difference, but I understand that yes, a lawsuit can be won, but then the power base, the power structure finds another maneuver to shut the door again. Is that the case?
That's true. Yeah, and so I don't want to be too pessimistic. I get yelled at a lot for being too pessimistic about this, but what my research has shown is that the people who are the most privileged, have the most protected and most exclusive neighborhoods, tend to find a way to maintain that exclusivity even when the law changes. But I don't want to be too pessimistic, because a little change is still a little change. And I can give you an example of a city here in California that was very, very exclusive, had basically no people of color and no people at the lower end of the income distribution. And they were sued under the Fair Housing Act. And now they have a little population of people of color. It's not a big population, but it's a little. That's something, right? It changes a little bit. And so, yeah, we're not going to change the world overnight, but I think chipping away is important. And I think that creating the legal framework and passing laws that allow people to bring lawsuits is a very important foundation. And maybe as the housing crisis worsens across the United States, this will become a more important tool. Right. So we're seeing this in California, where our housing crisis is, I don't know, maybe worst in the nation. It's very bad, right? We have no housing. We have not enough housing. We have too many jobs, wonderful, and not enough housing for people to take those jobs and live in these communities. And as that crisis comes to hit the middle class instead of just the people at the lower end of the income distribution, there has been more political pressure to make changes and to increase housing density and to change the regulatory framework.
Well, that is some encouragement.
Yeah.
So in your book, you say that when residential segregation happens across city lines rather than within a city across neighborhoods, it means that people who live in the disadvantaged places have no political ability to change the public goods that they receive. How so?
Okay, this is a complicated concept, so I'm gonna walk through it slowly. Initially, when cities got created, there weren't suburbs. They didn't exist. Okay, you either lived on a farm, like outside the city, or you lived in the city, within the city boundaries. And so our early patterns of segregation in the United States occurred within a city across neighborhoods. So as people began to move into the cities, we started to see whole sections of the city become predominantly inhabited by particular groups. So you probably have, in your lifetime, visited a Chinatown somewhere. That is an example of internal city segregation. So a community of people, a neighborhood that is all Black, or a neighborhood that is all Latinx, or all Asian or Chinese, is the kind of segregation that happens within a city. There's another kind of segregation that you're also familiar with. You just might have not thought of it this way. And that is segregation between two cities. And when we think of suburbanization and white flight, that is the second kind of segregation that we're talking about. That kind of segregation looks like the whole city, maybe say the city of Camden or the city of Detroit, is ringed by smaller suburban communities that tend to be much whiter and much wealthier than the city in the center. The reason why this is an important distinction to make, these two types of segregation, is because they have different political consequences and they have different policy solutions. The political consequences of an internally segregated city is that the neighborhoods end up being sort of unable to create cooperation. There's a lot of division across neighborhood lines, and that those divisions are overlaid with race and class, and that can be a very divided political community. But it's possible for marginalized neighborhoods to win control of the city council, to win power in the city government, and redistribute city benefits to that neighborhood. It's possible. It's not common, but it's possible. When you have the second kind of segregation, the segregation between cities, between a major city and its suburb, or between suburbs, we can all think about suburbs that we know that are very diverse, and other suburbs that we can think of that are very exclusively white and wealthy. That kind of segregation cannot be solved politically internally. Think about this from a school district's perspective, okay? So your kids, my kids, go to school in the inner city, in the Merced City schools. There is a neighboring school district in Atwater, which is a much wealthier and better funded school district. But it doesn't matter who I elect to the Merced School Board or the Merced City Council, my kids are never going to be able to access the resources from the Atwater School District because it's a wholly separate government. So those separations across city lines can be much more difficult to figure out how to undo. And oftentimes it takes action by a regional entity, like a regional governing structure, or the state government or the federal government, to force sharing. And we have seen this with school districts. So many states across the United States make it so that the least well-funded school districts get some funding from the best funded school districts, and that money is funneled through the state government and back down to those school districts. We could do the same thing with sewer funding, right? Or clean water, right? It's possible that Flint, Michigan could have clean water because the state government says we're going to provide a fund for every city in Michigan to have clean water, but they don't, right? Right now, we fund our water locally. We fund our sewer systems locally. We fund our garbage collection locally. And we fund our snow plowing locally, which is the nature of what I discovered when I first lived on the East Coast.
That feeds into my next question. Massachusetts is a home rule state. Each of our 351 municipalities has its own zoning, school systems, police, fire, et cetera. County governments play virtually no role. Is there evidence that hyperlocal control plays a role in increased segregation? And if we went to a more regional or county form of overseeing the municipalities, would that make a significant difference, do you think?
It could, yeah. So there is evidence that hyperlocalism, the way it's been studied is fragmentation. That's the kind of term that we use when we're studying this, or the governments are fragmented, contributes significantly to this kind of segregation that we were just talking about, the between city segregation, right? And there is evidence that having governments with larger footprints, so we actually, in the South, many of the school districts are county-wide rather than just citywide. And there's a long historically racist reason for that large footprint. But it turns out that it actually has benefited communities of color in the South because they've been able to access resources from the wealthier communities in that large footprint. And so, yes, the answer is there's some evidence to suggest that a larger geographic footprint that included wealthy and non-wealthy communities within the same governing structure could ameliorate some of these kinds of patterns of segregation. But I will say that it's basically politically untenable. And again, now I'm getting pessimistic again. It's very difficult to maintain regional governing structures, and it's very difficult to get the state to force communities to behave in ways that they don't want to behave. The reason why, and it's important to say, sort of to back up and say, a lot of my work is trying to show that segregation didn't happen by accident, and that this exclusivity and the hoarding of resources didn't happen by accident. And so once we understand that this was a purposeful effort, we can understand that undoing it is not going to be easy, because the people who benefit from this system are going to be the ones who are the most opposed to undoing it, right? And we will find political resistance. And basically every example of regional government that has been tried where there has been very powerful resource sharing has eventually collapsed.
I know in my own home state in Connecticut, we have counties, but we don't have a county form of government. And I'm from Bridgeport, Connecticut, very urban, a factory city that's struggled in the past 20 something years or so. But we're in Fairfield County, Connecticut, a very rich county, but there's resistance from the state officials. No, we don't want to share our wealth with these New Haven, Bridgeport, areas that are really struggling to keep themselves going. So right. I know it's hard to even get the conversation going.
That's right.
I wanted to ask you, run this past you as a legislation that passed recently in Massachusetts. Massachusetts passed legislation, enacted legislation that would require all MBTA communities, that's 178 of the 351 municipalities, to have at least one district of a reasonable size and in proximity to public transit, in which multifamily housing at a density of at least 15 units acre is permitted as of right. While many details are still being worked out, is this a step in the right direction?
This step, so 15 units per acre is a moderate density. That's not a high density requirement. A high density requirement would be something like 30, 40, 50 units per acre. That would really require multifamily development. 15 units per acre, though, is much denser probably than many of these communities have. And having the communities be required to enact this kind of zoning district is a step in the right direction. Here are the two caveats. One is that when states try to do these things, a lot of times cities will say, we just can't. Sorry. Like we looked and we looked and we looked, but there's just not a place to put it. So we don't know what to do. And the state will come back and say, you need to do this. And then the cities will say, whoa, we tried, we're looking, we're trying. Right. And it becomes a political battle, right? And so this happens in California. Maybe it doesn't happen in Massachusetts. Hopefully it doesn't happen in Massachusetts, but this is what happens in California, is that there's a lot of delay and there's a lot of attempts or false attempts to try to do things that don't actually end up working. The second caveat is that zoning is a first step and by right development is a first step, but it is not a guarantee of development. So you could zone, there's lots of communities that permit development up to very high densities, right? 30, 40, 50 units per acre. But if there are other aspects of the land use regulatory process that are going to make it hard for developers to come in and build those developments, we may never see them, right? And so one way in which this can occur, I'll give you an example here again from California, is that a city can have an overlay district that allows for very high density to be built in particular parts of town. But they also have a requirement that to take advantage of that overlay district, there has to be a public hearing. Now, your by right development legislation in Massachusetts suggests to me that that probably wouldn't be the case in Massachusetts, that there wouldn't be a public hearing, but many developers really dislike public hearings because they end up slowing the process, making the process much more expensive, and oftentimes changing the design and the development to make it unaffordable for the developer to build. And so we need to open the doors to this kind of development. Absolutely, we need to have the foundation there. And some of my colleagues who actually work on Massachusetts land use regulation have found that simply zoning for multifamily development is a very good predictor of actually building multifamily development. So yes, it is a good first step, but we can't just say, okay, we're done. We passed this legislation and now the world will change, because it may not, right? There may have to be continued attention and continued opportunity to make this kind of development available and possible. And frankly, to limit the amount of opposition that comes from the neighborhoods, because there will be opposition that comes from the neighborhoods. And then we have to decide, how do we feel about that in terms of our democracy, right? Does shutting down the voices of neighborhood residents seem like the right thing to do? To many people, it will not seem like the right thing to do, right?
Right. And you were saying earlier that the people who orchestrate segregation wanted to stay that way. So is there any point to trying to sway their convictions or open their minds to a different point of view?
I think there is. I think conversations are always valuable. And so sometimes people can be convinced by understanding the kind of coalition that they might be part of, right? So here in the Bay Area, in California, in the Bay Area, one of the things that motivates some coalitions to push for denser housing is an understanding that it is very environmentally unsustainable to have low density housing that sprawls out into the Central Valley. And the environmental concern can create a different kind of coalition than a coalition that is concerned purely with segregation on its face, right? There are other coalitions that get built around making sure that people who work in the community are able to live in the community, right? That our lower wage workers and the people who we rely on for everyday services are able to access the benefits of our community as well. So different coalitions can get built. And I think that having those conversations and trying to figure out what is the coalition that works in that community is a very valuable thing to do. It's also really important to take seriously concerns and worries about gentrification. Because what has happened historically is that our most marginalized communities have been the ones that have borne the brunt of any forced density from higher levels of government, right? And that when that happens, when a community of color that has, historically had sort of marginalized, status and had not a lot of housing options, when a ton of new housing gets built only in that community and not anywhere else, it can really price out the residents. And so again, making sure that coalition, whatever the coalition is that works for your community, involves voices of the marginalized communities is a very important piece of the puzzle and of the process as well.
And I'm sure you've heard from naysayers or people who look at your argument and say, this is hogwash in this country. Everybody has the ability to live a comfortable life if only they would work hard enough, or only if they would take care of their own community and not tear it up. Tell me about what you've heard when people say, no, Dr. Trounstine, I don't agree with you at all. What did people say to you?
The argument that this is all driven, that we live in a meritocracy, and that if only people would work harder, they could live anywhere they want. They could have access to the Palo Altos and Menlo Parks and Beverly Hillses of the world. It's an easy argument to make, but it's a pretty easy argument to break down, right? So if you can, sometimes I try to convince people that everyone wants to live. So one of the arguments that I hear is, well, I don't want dense housing in my neighborhood because it's going to bring crime and it's going to bring too many cars, and I don't want to live near poor people. And there is a bias against living near renters. People have a bias against living near people at the lower end of the income distribution. Mm-hmm. And what I try to convince people of is that everybody wants to live in a crime-free neighborhood. Everybody wants their children to go to good schools, and to believe that some people are deserving of unequal access to government benefits simply because they work in a job that doesn't pay very well, to me, is a moral question. And to some extent, I have to say, I disagree with your view of the world, right? If you believe that your dishwasher shouldn't get to have a good education for their children, I don't know that I can convince you.
And so more than 10 years of research and 100 years of quantitative and qualitative data, it all began with a puzzle. So Dr. Trounstine, have you solved the puzzle?
I'm getting closer. I'm getting closer. Yeah.
Or do we have to solve the puzzle? We as a society.
That's right. Yeah, we do. We have to solve the puzzle as a society. I think, the first thing to recognize is that segregation is embedded in our legal system. And in order to change that, we need to change our legal system. We need to change our land use regulations. We need to change the framework that permits segregation to persist. And because segregation has been embedded for so long, any regulation that prevents change in the land use in a community will entrench segregation. So we need to, as a society, be open to change, demographic change along race and class lines. And then that means change of our housing stock as well, and the way in which our cities are geographically laid out. So, people like the communities that they're in because they picked them because they are meaningful. But we have to stay open to the possibility of change.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Trounstine. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to do.
Thank you.